So this is a passage about stewardship. This is a passage about stewardship, and so we need to talk about stewardship today, but because we've been talking about financial stewardship, I worry that we may not be able to hear what this passage is saying to us. Because stewardship is about more than what we do with our finances. It's not about less than what we do with our finances, with our resources, but it is certainly about more. Though when we hear the word stewardship, we're almost always in church. And when we hear the word stewardship in church, we are almost always hearing it as something related to what we do with the giving of our financial resources or not. That's not necessarily what Paul is talking about here. Stewardship is actually at the core of what it means to be human. If we go all the way back to the beginning of Scripture, what we see when Adam and Eve were placed in the garden is that they were placed there to be stewards. Being a good steward is to do good with what you've been given, all that you've been given. Our stewardship is what we do with the things that we have been given. If you want to know what you've been uniquely put on this planet for, wrestle with what you've been given. Do an analysis of your own gifts, of all of the things God has blessed you with, and then think about what it might mean for you to be a good steward of that. This is what we see Paul doing in many ways with his life and calling, and this is what we see him describing here in this particular passage in Ephesians. It's about stewardship. And since we need to orient ourselves to a more expanded definition of stewardship, I thought I would begin by telling you the story of a couple of guys that I grew up playing football with. One of them was named Maurice. I've actually changed these names to protect the guilty. And the other one's name was Reggie. Maurice was a physical freak of nature. And I remember him being a physical freak of nature when we were even very small on the playground. He had incredible physical attributes. He was the kind of guy who could not work out at all, could never exercise, never go into the gym, never lift weights, and walk in his freshman year into the weight room and break the school squat record. He actually did that. He was a nose tackle on our freshman football team, and there was not a center in the state of Texas, or at least one that we played, that could keep him from the quarterback. Nobody got beyond the 50-yard line on us during our freshman year while he was playing. He was also the kind of guy whose presence, not just because of his imposing size, but because of his attitude and the way he was intimidating. He was intimidating. He had an intimidating presence not just to other students, but even, and I witnessed this in classrooms, with our teachers. He was intimidated in almost every way. He had an incredible sense of humor. He was smart. He had all of those gifts and attributes, but you know, he seemed to be good at almost everything without really even trying. And maybe that was part of the problem. Because it was really difficult, as long as I knew him, to really get him to care about anything. In fact, the way all of these gifts he's had seem to play out and translate into life was usually, at some form or another, of him getting into trouble. And him getting into trouble, him actually being punished or disciplined for something that he did that he wasn't supposed to do, was not an easy thing. Because nobody wanted him in trouble. The teachers didn't want him in trouble. The coaches really didn't want him in trouble. The coaches didn't want him in trouble because the things he could do made what they did look even better than they had gifts to do it with. You know, they wanted him on the football field. Reggie, though, was a different story. When I started playing football in the 7th grade and met Reggie, he was our third string tailback on a pretty good team. And nobody really knew much about Reggie. He didn't seem to have much. We didn't actually know where he lived. He lived somewhere way far out of town in the country. The only thing I really remember about Reggie, besides the fact that he sat on the bench and played tailback, but third string, was that at some point during that year, he was a part of a campfire accident and he burned the skin on his legs, and that knocked him out for a while. I also know, or at least surmise from what I came to know, that Reggie was determined, that he was a hard worker in almost everything he put his mind to. Because at some point during my 7th grade year, Maurice got kicked off the team. He got kicked off the team for doing something in school or in the community that the coaches and the teachers just couldn't ignore. And so he was out. And that's what I remember about him, and I don't really remember much more about Reggie's 7th grade season. Now, in the 9th grade, the freshman coaches, after we started the year, went to Maurice, found him, and recruited him to play football again. They basically begged him to play football, and he said he would. And once he got eligible again, because he didn't start the season eligible, at about mid-season, they reshaped the whole defense around his skill set. We didn't have a nose tackle, but now we did. And they put him in there, and he began to work in that way, and then they would use him in every other way they could as well. The guy was, as a freshman, 6 foot tall and 310 pounds, so you would imagine if they were going to put him on offense, they would put him on the line, but they would run him every now and then as a fullback. And I'll never forget one play when they handed the ball off to him. We had 1 or 2 yards to gain for the first down, and he just hit the middle, because the thought was, if he hits the middle, nobody's going to be able to stop him. He hits the middle, and he may have gotten the 1 or 2 yards, but they were stopping him. He was still on his feet, so he bounced back and ran around the corner. I mean, a really fast-moving big guy. And he began to break around the sideline for the end zone with one guy to beat. Now, that one guy, the cornerback, who, if you can imagine, was a much skinnier, smaller guy, was coming up to tackle him. And instead of running over him or around him, what Maurice did was he had these lineman gloves on that had a little padding to them. And you could see him, almost as if it was in slow motion, draw his right hand back, wait till the guy got in front of him, and he clocked him in the helmet, knocking the guy straight to the ground. He then ran over him and went into the end zone for what would have been a touchdown, but the referees threw the flag, and they called it back, and our coaches didn't seem to care. They were laughing and cheering on the sideline. They thought it was the greatest thing they'd ever seen, and they still talk about it. I remember in the midst of all of that, during practice one day, the coaches doing something that because I knew Maurice, even wondered at the time if it was a good idea. They said, to make an example of him in front of everyone, that, Maurice could be making millions of dollars one day playing in the NFL. They highlighted that for him. They spoke that into existence in front of all of us. But by the end of that season, or before the next season began, Maurice was off the team again. And the last I actually heard of him was that at some point after high school, he was working as a bodyguard for a drug dealer. And that's not an exaggeration. Reggie, on the other hand, kept working, and he kept growing. Eventually, his junior year in high school and his senior year, he was all-state at defensive end. He was recruited to play linebacker for the University of Arkansas, redshirted his freshman season, and started all 4 years after that. He didn't go into the NFL, not completely. He played several years on an NFL practice squad. He earned his degree, and all of that made a huge difference in his life and in the life of his family and his friends and his community. Now, these are stories of stewardship. And I'm telling you them in hopes that they will lift off this page the theme of stewardship as it is prevalent in this scripture today. Maurice was born with obvious, undeniable gifts that when applied to the game of football translated into stunning, tall tale-like dominance. Maurice could have multiplied those gifts into a lot of good for himself and others in the world, but instead of stewarding his gifts well, he squandered them. In the grand scheme of things, I'm not sure he really did much with them at all. But Reggie took what he was given, and to many of us who knew him from the beginning, he wasn't really given much at all. But he took what he was given and he stewarded it into something that changed the course of his and his family's life. Stewardship is about what we do with what we've been given. And good biblical stewardship is about how we multiply those gifts in our families, and in our neighborhoods, and in our churches, and in our community, and in our world for God's good purposes. And so the question might be for you, are you making much of what God has given you? Are you stewarding God's gifts of grace in your life well? Are you a Maurice or are you a Reggie? The Apostle Paul, in deed and word, was encouraging all of us to be more like Reggie, to make much out of all we've been given by Christ, for Christ. We spent the last few weeks talking about the gospel because that's what Paul is doing here in Ephesians, talking about the gospel. Talking about what the gospel is and what it's for and why it is and who it's for. And in short, the gospel, Paul is saying, is for, as Angie said earlier, everyone. And not only that, the gospel has a power to it that is meant to enable and equip us to live out Christ's greatest commandments. To love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love all of our neighbors as ourselves. Our neighbors are everyone, we know, Jesus teaches, and the gospel is for everyone. And Paul says here that this gospel has come to him not just as a gift of grace to be received, but that it's a work. It's a work that comes in and through our lives, and that work is also a grace enabled by grace. In fact, in the Message translation that we heard Carol read earlier, he even calls the gospel and this grace his life's work. This is my life work, Paul writes, helping people understand and respond to this message, which is the gospel. Now, here's the thing I don't want us to miss about grace in this verse, because we could just fly right by it. In this passage of Scripture, grace is not about Paul's salvation. No, in this passage of Scripture, grace is about Paul's ministry, which he calls his life's work. Paul was made a servant of the gospel by the gift of God's grace, meaning the gift of God's grace isn't only about saving you from death or punishment, but it is about you giving your life to God's work for you in this world. To the work that God has uniquely gifted you for. In other words, like Paul, the purpose of the gospel of God's grace for you is not just that you receive it, but that you do something with it. God's grace is a gift that you have been given to steward. Remember, when we do family dedications, baby dedications here, I say to the parents, this child does not belong to you, but is a gift of God that has been given to you for a season. You are stewards of this child's life. so that it will know that it is God's child first and last. And all of that is meant to help you and your child understand that you are also God's child first and last, which is a gift that comes not just with privilege, but with responsibility that is supposed to shape and define the meaning and the impact of your life. The gospel of God's grace isn't just supposed to be Paul's life's work. It's supposed to be your life's work, and it's supposed to be our life's work. And if the parable of Jesus on stewardship are any indicators, listen to this, our lives will ultimately be judged by how we steward and cultivate and multiply the gifts of God's grace that have been given to us, or how we don't. People in Atlanta, Texas who knew Maurice still reminisce from time to time about his exploits on and off the football field. And they wonder what might have been if he had only stewarded those gifts well. People in Atlanta, Texas are proud of Reggie and what he was able to accomplish with those gifts. And those of us who knew him from the beginning know it was because he stewarded those gifts so well. How are you doing with the gifts God has given you? What kind of steward are you? Friends, your compassion is a gift of God's grace. And your intellect is a gift of God's grace. And the forgiveness and the mercy that you have received in your life are gifts of God's grace. Your resources are a gift of God's grace. The kindness in your heart is a gift of God's grace. The love that you have experienced and the love that you have shared in your life are gifts of God's grace. Your talents and your abilities and your experiences are gifts of God's grace, whether they have been stewarded and sharpened well or whether they have not. It's all a gift of God's grace. They are God's gift to you to be used with a purpose. The air in your lungs, the power in your muscles, the very life that animates you right now, all of it is a gift of God's grace given for a purpose. What are you doing with all of that? How are you stewarding God's grace in your life? What is your life's work? And what is our life's work as a church? What have we been given, and how might we steward it well in the days ahead? How we do it, is something we'll continue to work out. But that we do it is something that all of us should renew our commitment to right now. God's grace is abundant in all of our lives. And no hardship that we are going through or will ever go through changes that. It didn't change it for Paul, who was shipwrecked and beaten and maligned and persecuted. He wrote this letter from a prison where he was serving as a prisoner. And yet, he always knew, no matter how difficult or depressing things might be, his life and his mission and his work was a gift of God's grace that he wanted to steward well. His life's work was stewarding the gospel of God's grace well. What might it mean for you to steward the gospel of God's grace well in the days ahead? God's grace was not given to you merely as a privilege. It was given also as a responsibility. You're supposed to do something with it. We're supposed to give our lives for it and to it. The living and the sharing of the gospel of God's grace is our life's work, without question. The only question is, how will it be your life's work moving forward?